Good morning. In just a few minutes, we'll be partaking together in the supper. And I suppose that once the topic is introduced, you won't have any trouble seeing how it connects back to the Lord's Supper. I want to talk this morning about injustice. Invite you to follow along as we prepare to focus for yet another aspect of the Lord's Supper. And as you've seen by now, since we've been doing this for a couple of years, that there's just an endless number of stories that could be told from the supper itself and connecting us back to Christ and to one another through it. You can understand the heart and the values of a culture by listening to the stories that it tells. The stories that we read from classic literature, the fairy tales, the legends, and these days, over the past century or so, the movies. Perhaps the most important themes are the ones that are persistent within a culture, across generation, or even across cultures. There seems to be a perpetual fascination throughout time, especially in Christian cultures, with this idea of justice. And although not a uniquely Christian phenomenon, it especially concentrates in Christian cultures. The following slide shows a list of well-known stories sampled from across generations that highlights injustice as a major theme. The first story that I have up here is The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexander Dumas. If you've ever read that story, starts out in a way that's just infuriating. You know, you have this guy who's just offered up by his closest friends and companions, and he's perfectly innocent of all the crimes that he's accused of, and yet goes to jail apparently for life because of crimes that he didn't commit. And in such a way that he's not only betrayed by, but completely abandoned by his companions who could have vindicated him. Another story, and this one's more recent, is The Crucible by Arthur Miller. It was started out as a play, but has become recently a movie. And it's about the Salem witch trials. It has to do with a bunch of teenage girls acting like teenage girls, and how a mob frenzy occurred wherein they were all accused of being witches and then eventually killed. And even the guy who stands up to show what an injustice this was ends up being caught up in the very injustice that he was clarifying, and so he was killed as well. Sorry if I gave that up for you. Then there's Robin Hood. I'll probably give this one up for you too. Of course, this is a legend. We don't know who the original author was, but a commonly recurring theme in injustice tropes is the poor being oppressed by the wealthy, and especially when it goes to extremes. Then we have The Scarlet Letter. These are all stories we're familiar with, aren't they? Nathaniel Hawthorne. Here you have persecution by the religious elite, and especially insidious kind of injustice, because those who are supposed to be protecting us end up being the perpetrators. And then the public humiliation of the woman in The Scarlet Letter that followed. In Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare, Shakespeare seems to have a particular fascination with injustice as one of the major themes in his works. And in Julius Caesar, Caesar is personally betrayed by even his closest compatriots, including Brutus. And then you have that famous line, "You also, Brutus?" as he's being assaulted and killed by those who stood by him. Les Miserables, Victor Hugo, is a story of disproportionate punishment. Anytime somebody is punished disproportionately, we sense the injustice in that immediately. It seems to be in our DNA that when somebody is starving, and he steals bread to feed his family and goes to prison and sentenced to 19 years in prison for stealing bread. Seems to be a little out of place, doesn't it? And here we have Cinderella. The classic fairy tale is a story of injustice because at the time when Cinderella is most vulnerable, when she's lost both her mother and then her father, she is persecuted and humiliated by her and verbally abused by her stepsisters and stepmother. Here is Hamlet, also by William Shakespeare. And one of the forms of injustice that shows up here that's particularly acute is when his mother is present at the time that he dies as a result of a conspiracy, and he conveys to his mother the conspiracy as he's dying. And the grief of the mother becomes part of the theme of that drama. And the last one that I'll put up here is 1984 by George Orwell. And this is the case of a repressive regime that subjects a person to physical and mental cruelty. And this is a sort of early embodiment of Stockholm Syndrome, where he's forced then by such cruelty to love Big Brother, the one who's responsible for his torture. Now, all of these are different embodiments of this same idea of injustice. But what makes these stories so compelling? One is that we all have a kind of an innate sense of injustice, what's just and what's unjust, unless we have suppressed it. We may suppress our sense of injustice sometimes, and we become blind to the injustices that we perpetrate against other people. Whatever your politics or your ideas of equality and justice and fairness are uniquely Christian values. These ideas of social injustice permeate Christian cultures far disproportionately than they do other cultures. The reason we're so concerned about justice is because Jesus exists at the center of our culture, and he is our example of the ultimate injustice. Because every aspect of injustice that is shown on this slide occurred in the trial, the death, the persecution of Jesus. Now, part of what makes these stories so satisfying, if they are satisfying, some of them don't really have a happy ending, but part of what makes them so satisfying is that they do have a happy ending. And, for example, the Count of Monte Cristo gets revenge on the evil friends who sent him off to prison and didn't care about him anymore. Jesus didn't get revenge. But it's a story with a happy ending nonetheless, because like Cinderella, who didn't turn on her stepsisters and vindicate herself, except in some of the more modern retellings of the story, Cinderella got her elevation in social status above her stepsisters and above her stepmother, and she got the handsome prince, and they lived happily ever after. And so that's one of the things that makes this a timeless story that's so worth retelling, is that Cinderella is finally vindicated, but without taking vengeance on her own behalf. And that also is true of Jesus, isn't it? He was ultimately vindicated, but it wasn't because he took out vengeance against his persecutors. In fact, it was Jesus who hung on the cross saying, "Father, forgive them." So Jesus has to be vindicated a different way. And how was he vindicated? Well, of course, that took place in the resurrection. And here is an ancient prophecy from the Psalms about Jesus that's quoted again in Acts chapter 2. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. So the vindication of Jesus that was spoken of by the prophets and highlighted in Acts chapter 2 when Peter spoke on the first Pentecost after the resurrection of Christ is a story of vindication, how Christ sat down on the right hand of God, victor over death, and now master of the very ones who persecuted him, and offering a way for those outside of his protection to come in, even those who persecuted them, even those who were even responsible for putting him to death. So this is the ultimate injustice that matches well with the ultimate vindication. And it's a vindication that plays out in our lives because we, no matter what we have perpetrated against the Christ, have a way of being vindicated through the very Christ that we have done injustice to in the actions that we engage in our lives. So it's a story that extends to us and it permeates our society, and it's not unsurprising then that this kind of story of injustice and vindication permeates all of our literature and our stories. It's a story worth telling, no matter how you tell it. And we just need to recognize that when we're telling these other stories, this is really the story that we're telling. We're really telling the story, retelling the story of the ultimate injustice and the ultimate vindication. So as we partake of the bread and the cup this morning, we're going to remember a death. And we're going to remember a broken body, a body that has been broken through abuse and suffering. And we're going to recognize the spilling of blood. And as we do that and we think about that injustice, we think about our own vindication through that very bread and through that blood. Let's partake of the supper now together.